Lock the doors, turn out the lights, and climb into bed. It's time for Hillbilly Deadtime Stories.
Any type of building or structure can be haunted. It can be a personal dwelling, such as the house or an apartment, as well as a business. Sometimes these hauntings can be the result of an incident that happened within the walls of that building, or even on the land that the building was built upon. In other cases, the haunting can be from a former tenant or employee. We've all heard stories of a former owner of a house who just didn't want to leave the house that they loved so much. Then there are the stories of the bellhop or the nurse who just can't stop helping others, even after death. I've spent the last 5 years on Hillbilly Horror Stories podcast telling you stories of haunted places of all types, but never a haunted florist. Until tonight. One of the Pittsburgh area's longest-lasting floral shops was Michael Blaha Flowers. Though recently closing, it enjoyed over 120 years of longevity. The company's founder, Michael Blaha, started the company in Etna, Pennsylvania in 1900 when he would stroll the streets with his flower cart. David Cornley would eventually decide to start his own flower shop. He would often look at the building on Bridge Street and think about what a wonderful location this would be. But he decided that it would not be a smart move to compete with the well-established Michael Blaha's Flowers on Butler Street. After some thought, he bought Blaha's Flowers and moved it to the Bridge Street location. At this time, the building's owner, Kevin Burke, told David, "I'm not going to lie to you, the building is haunted." David was from the area and he had heard the rumors of a little boy by the name of Peter who had haunted the building for well over 100 years. David said that he never believed in any of the rumors and that ghosts didn't bother him anyway. His opinion would soon change. The exact history of the building is unclear, but we know that it has been the Colonial House Hotel, later a tavern and restaurant, and at one time a bordello. Peter was the 8-year-old illegitimate child of one of the bordello's workers. He and his mother resided on the 3rd floor. The story goes that Peter wasn't allowed out much, but somehow was able to obtain some firecrackers. While playing with these firecrackers, he caught the building on fire and was subsequently killed in that fire. Kevin Burke found evidence of this fire when he remodeled the 2nd and the 3rd floor apartments. Peter's spirit is apparently still frightened of fire. A tenant that was living on the 3rd floor was using a kerosene heater. He kept the kerosene on the 2nd floor, which was vacant, as a safety measure. One day the tenant found the pump in a 2nd floor sink, but the actual kerosene can was in the basement. When the tenant asked Burke if he didn't agree with how he was storing the kerosene, he was perplexed. When informed that the can was found in the basement, Burke commented that he had not moved the can to the basement. Peter's pranks were always of a mischievous nature, never malicious. He likes to rearrange and play with things, and has even touched several tenants. The Vecchio sisters, who ran an antique shop called Echoes in the building from 1977 to 1982, had their fair share of experiences. People in their shop would get cold for no reason, have their hair tugged on, or see a rocking chair rock on its own accord. Items in the store were continually misplaced, candles turned over, and pages torn out of workbooks. Once a heavy workbook that had been on the wall was found on the floor 7 feet away. On one occasion, a small tree with animal ornaments was seen violently shaking. The two sisters think that Peter would sleep in one of their antique cribs that they would use to display dolls. They would come in early in the morning to find the dolls in disarray and the blanket that was folded hanging on the rail of the crib lying on the floor. Originally, the spirit was named Ralph, but a 9-hour visit from a medium determined that his name was Peter. David Cornley said that a month before his grand opening, he placed a paper sign on the window announcing that Michael Blaha's Flowers was relocating to this location. David said it was perfectly straight and very well secured when he left for the evening. The next day, the sign looked like it had been removed and put back up by a child. The sign was all wrinkled and crooked. Peter apparently also likes electronics. David said that he had a brand new answering machine when he moved into the building. It worked fine, we moved in, and then it suddenly wouldn't work at all. They had the phone company out 3 or 4 times to no avail. Eventually, the answering machine became covered up with papers and such after the first few months of business. The company had 3 rollover lines, which meant that if someone called the first line and it was busy, it would then roll over to the second line, and the same if the second was busy, it would roll over to the third line. On Mother's Day, the third line started ringing, but there was no one to answer it. Much to David's surprise, the answering machine kicked on. It had never worked before. David Cornley likes to tell the story of the missing stuffed animal. They had 2 stuffed mother dogs and 2 puppies. They had sold a mother and 2 puppies. He came in one morning and didn't see the other mother dog, and he asked who sold it. His staff replied that they thought he had sold it. They looked all over the shop and could never find it. Approximately 8 months later, David was upstairs and he found the dog in a plastic bag. No one had been up there. I guess even ghost children want to have pets.
Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Or Daddy has to fight off a zombie herd. And once that zombie herd is dead, Daddy has to hack off the devil's head. And if that devil's head gets hacked, Daddy has to hunt down a werewolf pack. And when that werewolf pack goes down, Daddy has to slaughter an evil clown. And after the evil clown is killed, Daddy has to take on a vampire guild. So hush, little baby, don't you cry, or Daddy and the whole family will die.
Don't be afraid. Lock the doors. Turn out the lights and climb into bed. It's time for Hillbilly Deadtime Stories.
Cemeteries can bring about a variety of emotions in people. Some like to make a day of visiting a beautifully landscaped cemetery such as Laurel Hill in Philadelphia. Such beautiful surroundings can bring peace to you regardless of why that setting exists. The lush gardens and splendid architecture, mausoleums and headstones can make it easy to block out the fact that you are surrounded by dead bodies. For others, wandering around a cemetery can bring about the feelings of sorrow from the loss of someone close. You'd like to think that your loved one's final resting place will bring them the eternal peace that they deserve. Unfortunately, some cemeteries have a horribly hidden past that will definitely not let its residents rest in peace. If you ever want to see a side-by-side example of a cemetery that you would be honored to have your family buried in as opposed to one that would give you nightmares to have a loved one spend an eternity, look no further than Cave Hill Cemetery and Eastern Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky. Cave Hill Cemetery is the final resting place of various military heroes as well as noted public figures such as Colonel Harlan Sanders from Kentucky Fried Chicken fame, famous explorer George Rogers Clark, and one of the most popular athletes of all time, Muhammad Ali. Cave Hill is a popular tourist attraction and a Louisville treasure. Many assume that the small cemetery next to Cave Hill is simply part of it because it's so close, but in fact, Eastern Cemetery has been abandoned for decades and has quite the troubled past. Eastern Cemetery sits on 28 acres and is one of Louisville's oldest cemeteries, being established in the 1840s. The past wasn't always troubled. In fact, the cemetery gained notoriety for being one of the first in America to allow people from different races and ethnicities on the same property. This was unheard of at the time. Eastern Cemetery is a resting place to people from various backgrounds, such as ministers from different religions, Union and Confederate soldiers, slaves, Freemasons, and veterans from all of the major wars. This cemetery was also in the forefront of technology in the 1930s, bringing the city's first crematoriums. Things would eventually take a drastic turn for the worse. Anthropologists have found that bodies were actually being buried in graves that were already occupied by corpses. That meant that a family plot, for example, would disturbingly be used multiple times. There have been 4 different grave maps of Eastern Cemetery. They were issued in 1880, 1907, 1962, and 1984. All of these maps are completely different from each other. This is further evidence that the plots were resold and reused for multiple burials. This is not the end of what would be horrifying enough news for the families with loved ones interred here. The New York Times released an article in 1989 that revealed another disturbing fact about Eastern Cemetery. Headstones and even bodies were being moved without informing the loved ones of the deceased. That meant that the headstones and the bodies are mismatched, making it near impossible for a family to know whether a deceased family member is actually buried. More disturbing news also came from this New York Times article. Approximately 70 infants were found buried over top of other people's remains. Most were only buried 10 to 18 inches below the surface. Friends of the Eastern Cemetery, a non-profit organization of volunteers, are working to heal this cemetery with such a checkered past. They pick up the trash, maintain the landscape, and are repairing headstones. So just how many people are actually buried at Eastern Cemetery? The capacity was set for 18,000, but many believe that the actual number is closer to 51,000.
Hush, little baby, has to fight off a zombie herd. And once that zombie herd is dead, Daddy has to hack off the devil's head. And if that devil's head gets hacked, Daddy has to hunt down a werewolf pack. And when that werewolf pack goes down, Daddy has to slaughter an evil clown. And after the evil clown is killed, Daddy has to take on a vampire guild. So hush, little baby, don't you cry, or Daddy and the whole family will die.
Don't be afraid. Lock the doors. Turn out the lights and climb into bed. It's time for Hillbilly Deadtime Stories.
Some of your favorite memories probably involve going out to eat at a restaurant. It could be as a small child out with your parents, ordering from the children's menu and anxiously awaiting ice cream that would surely follow. Maybe it's a memory of celebrating a special occasion such as a birthday or anniversary with your favorite meals surrounded by friends and family. You can almost always expect good food, laughs, and joy when dining at a restaurant. One thing that you probably don't expect is a ghost joining you for your meal. Sometimes this may be the case even if you don't realize it. There are millions of restaurants around the world, some of which serve liquor, some of which serve other spirits. Tonight you will learn about one in Little River, South Carolina, the Brentwood Restaurant and Wine Bistro. This beautiful Victorian home was built in 1910 by Clarence and Essie Besant McCorsley. After Clarence's death in 1943, Essie started renting out some of the rooms to fishermen that were visiting the little area. This allowed her to bring in enough income to keep the home. The building was moved from its original location on the corner of McCorsley Avenue to its current location on Luck Avenue sometime in the late 1960s. After the move, the home became a restaurant by the name of Grandma Mary's, specializing in home cooking. The home was purchased 3 times in the 1970s, each time becoming a restaurant with a different name. The last restaurant would eventually close in the 1980s, and it sat vacant until the Stublick brothers from Brentwood, Long Island, bought and restored the structure. Ownership changed to Eric and Kim Masson following the retirement of the brothers in 2007, and they turned it into a fine French restaurant. After just a few weeks of owning it, the Massons quickly learned that there was something different about this place. Kim said that she would hear voices and noises when she was using the ladies' room. She assumed it was someone's radio. But a few days later, Eric had a similar experience. He said that the sounds were just a few inches from his face on the other side of the door, and he froze. He wasn't sure what to do. These types of incidents were not relegated to just the owners. Several customers on different occasions had been locked in the second floor bathroom. Kim recalls on one instance that the customer couldn't get out. It was like the door was cemented shut. When the young woman started screaming, the door easily opened. The paranormal activity ranges from phantom noises to unexplained movements to wine glasses that regularly fall off the tables and the shelf at the bar. They don't just fall off, they crash to the ground with force. The employees and diners have witnessed multiple ghostly things in the restaurant. Disembodied voices have been heard in the hallways. Disembodied footsteps have been captured on their security cameras. Someone has been spotted in the upstairs window when there is no one on that floor. The restaurant's equipment has been seen starting and stopping on its own accord. Before the restaurant implemented a no smoking policy, ashtrays would inch to the edge of the table and then fall to the floor. Many people will leave the restaurant and go home and notice as they're flipping through their pictures that there are several orbs that they didn't notice during the time that the picture was taken. There's speculation that there may be as many as 13 spirits that reside in the restaurant. So many paranormal stories have emerged from the restaurant that it was featured on A&E's television show My Ghost Story back in 2011. The Masons, looking for some answers, invited a group of paranormal investigators to examine the premises. The lead investigator said that his crew saw some things such as a dumbwaiter moving on its own and reflection in a mirror, and that he just couldn't explain it. So the Masons decided to just accept the haunting and deal with it. They embraced the haunting and hoped that you come for the ghost, but stay for the food. Eric Masson said that they have an agreement with the ghost. I leave them alone, and they leave us alone.
Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Or Daddy has to fight off a zombie herd. And once that zombie herd is dead, Daddy has to hack off the devil's head. And if that devil's head gets hacked, Daddy has to hunt down a werewolf pack. And when that werewolf pack goes down, Daddy has to slaughter an evil clown. And after the evil clown is killed, Daddy has to take on a vampire guild. So hush, little baby, don't you cry, or Daddy and the whole family will die.
Don't be afraid. Lock the doors. Turn out the lights and climb into bed. It's time for Hillbilly Deadtime Stories.
Living in Kentucky, I've been blessed to have heard so many great local stories involving the paranormal, UFOs, cryptids, or at the very least stories that were basically unexplainable. Some are very well known, such as the horrific suffering that went on in Waverly Hills Sanatorium while it was a fully functional tuberculosis hospital. The tales of hauntings since its closing are known worldwide. Of course, the same can be said of Bobby Mackey's Music World, dubbed the world's most haunted nightclub. There are other stories that are well renowned, such as the Poplick Monster, a half-man, half-goat creature that lures you to an active train track, sometimes resulting in death. The Goat Man will be the subject of its own episode very soon. Kentucky, like most other states, has hundreds of lesser-known legends, one of which is the legend of Gilbert Spencer. Even though the Civil War was 150 years ago, there are still old-timers in Kentucky who have stories to tell from that time. Most of these have been passed on through parents and grandparents. The story of Gilbert Spencer is one of the most popular in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. During the Civil War, many men from the area left to fight, some for the North, some for the South. Many boys that were 17 years of age were also called upon to fight. That was the case with Carolyn Spencer's family. She had a husband and 3 sons. In 1862, her husband Jim left to join the Confederate forces. Her 2 older sons, William and Elias, soon joined him to fight for the South. This left Carolyn alone with her 13-year-old son Gilbert to work the farm in what is now Sandy Ridge. It was a difficult task, but through their hard work, they managed to keep the farm going during their absence. Things would take a horrific turn in the summer of 1864. During the Civil War, it was not uncommon for troops from the North and the South to raid homes and farms and steal whatever they wanted from these places. This was usually because the robbers knew that in most cases that there would be no men there to protect the property since they were off at war. On a hot July day, 4 soldiers rode onto the Spencer's farm. Carolyn and Spencer rushed to the front door to meet the soldiers. They were in Confederate uniforms, so Carolyn assumed that they were delivering information about the war or about her husband and sons. As Carolyn and her son stood in the doorway, the lead soldier halted his horse and asked her to fetch her husband or an older boy. Carolyn informed them that they were all fighting for the South. This news brought an evil grin to all 4 of the men's faces. One of the soldiers, a heavy-set man with a thick beard, pointed his rifle at Carolyn and Spencer. He informed Carolyn that if she interfered with what his men were about to do, that he would shoot her son. The soldiers dismounted and proceeded to enter the home, destroy furniture, rip up clothing, and steal anything of value, stuffing their pockets full before emerging the farmhouse. Carolyn could only stand and watch as the bearded soldier held the rifle flush to Gilbert's head. As the men stumbled out reeking of alcohol, as if they hadn't done enough, one of them calmly walked over to the barn and set it on fire. Carolyn and Spencer could only watch in horror and disbelief. Carolyn, in shock, was at least thankful that her nor her son had been harmed. Unfortunately, the carnage was not over. The bearded man with the rifle jumped off his horse. He walked to Carolyn and said, "Me and my buddies have a disagreement. They think that I can't shoot worth a lick, but I know I'm a good shot." The other men started to loudly laugh. He then said, "Miss, your son looks like he could outrun a rabbit. I want him to take off running across the field towards that fence over yonder. I'm going to count to 50 and shoot to kill. If he can make it over that fence before I get to 50, or if I miss him with my first shot, I'll let him live. If he doesn't run, I'm going to shoot both of you." The other men laughed so loud that they could barely stay in their saddles. Carolyn bent over to take a small wooden cross out of her dress pocket, and she handed it to Gilbert, who was trembling. She whispered that she would not let him run. But Gilbert then suddenly turned toward the 4 men and said, "I'll see you in hell," and he took off running as fast as he could. The bearded soldier carefully aimed his rifle and started counting as the others laughed feverishly. 26, 27, 28. Gilbert was getting close to the fence. 45, 46, 47. He reached the fence and his mother screamed, "Jump!" Gilbert jumped high above the wooden fence. 50. The shot echoed as Gilbert's head exploded in a mist of blood and skull fragments. The other soldiers laughed and praised the shooter for his remarkable aim as they rode off into the distance. Carolyn sat horrified. In a shattered state of mind, she made it 2 miles to the neighbor's home. It was well after dark when she arrived in a panic. Old Man Holland and his wife grabbed lanterns and they made their way back to the Spencer's farm. Despite their best efforts, Gilbert's body could not be found. They found bits of skull fragments and a large patch of blood by the fence, but no body. Over the next few months, Carolyn tried her best to recover from the murder, theft, and vandalism. Her husband and other 2 sons came back from the war, and life began to return as close to normal as possible. One day, a rider approached the Spencer's farm, excitedly yelling to come see what he had found. As Carolyn and the men followed the rider, she thought of Gilbert for some reason. What they saw in the field would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The rider led them to a small clearing. In that clearing were the bodies of the same 4 men who had killed her son. Each had shattered skulls. The items they had stolen lay next to their bodies, and tied around each of their necks, a small wooden cross.
Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Or Daddy has to fight off a zombie herd. And once that zombie herd is dead, Daddy has to hack off the devil's head. And if that devil's head gets hacked, Daddy has to hunt down a werewolf pack. And when that werewolf pack goes down, Daddy has to slaughter an evil clown. And after the evil clown is killed, Daddy has to take on a vampire guild. So hush, little baby, don't you cry, or Daddy and the whole family will die.
Don't be afraid. Lock the doors. Turn out the lights and climb into bed. It's time for Hillbilly Deadtime Stories.
In the United States, when someone mentions witches, our thoughts immediately drift to Salem, Massachusetts. It only makes sense considering that the Salem witch trials are still a hot topic today, 329 years after the last one was executed for being a witch. Salem has embraced its dark history and welcomes thousands of tourists every year. Most come to see the sights associated with the witch trials, and the streets are crawling with tourists through the whole month of October. If you dig a little deeper into America's belief in witches, you will find that Salem wasn't the first witch hunt to take place here. That actually happened 30 years earlier in 1662, a witch hunt that would result in 7 trials and 4 executions. It was late March of 1662 in Hartford, Connecticut. John and Bethia Kelly were grieving the loss of their 8-year-old daughter. Little Elizabeth had been fine in recent days. That was before she had spent time with her neighbor, Goody Ayers. The family, grief-stricken, were desperate for answers. They could only reflect upon the words that their daughter had said the night she returned from the neighbor's house. "Father, Father, help me, help me. Goodwife Ayers is upon me. She chokes me. She kneels on my belly. She will break my bowels. She pinches me. She will make me black and blue." After Elizabeth's death, whispers of witchcraft enveloped the town. Fingers were pointed towards several townspeople. Panic ripped through the streets, for Hartford had been the site of the first ever execution of a suspected witch in the colonies a generation ago on May 26, 1647. On that day, Alice Young was sent to the gallows erected at the Hartford's Meeting House Square. Connecticut's old State House now stands where the gallows once stood. Witchcraft was one of the 12 capital crimes decreed by Connecticut's colonial government in 1642. The legal precedent cited? The Word of God. Biblical passages such as Exodus chapter 22, verse 18, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," and Leviticus chapter 20, verse 27, "A man also or woman that hath a familiar spirit, or that is a wizard, shall surely be put to death." Between 1642 and 1662, 7 people were executed for being witches. However, it was in Hartford in 1662, 30 years before the infamous Salem witch trials, that a witch hunt hysteria took hold, resulting in 7 trials and 4 executions. Shortly after Elizabeth's death, the devoutly religious Anne Cole had an affliction that caused her to shake violently and spout blasphemy. A witness said that Anne Cole was taken with strange fits, wherein she, or rather the devil, held a discourse for a considerable time. Anne Cole claimed that she had been bewitched by her neighbor Rebecca Greensmith. As was the case in this time period, if a person wasn't very clean, kept to themselves, or had a less than charming personality, they were oftentimes assumed to be a witch. That was the case here. Rebecca was described by a townsperson to be a lewd, ignorant, considerably aged woman. Keep in mind that the Kellys had already blamed Goody Ayers for the death of their daughter. Soon, those accused started to accuse others as being actual witches, and this in some cases included their spouses. Neighbors began testifying against neighbors and taking sides. Goody Ayers' husband, maybe in an attempt to spare his wife, accused Rebecca Greensmith of being a witch. Greensmith did not do herself any favors. The most damning testimony supposedly came from her. Maybe it was out of spite or her way of ridiculing the courts, but she admitted to having familiarity with the devil and said that at Christmas they would have a merry meeting to form a covenant. Greensmith implicated her husband and said that she had met in the woods with 7 other witches, including Goody Ayers, Mary Sanford, and Elizabeth Seeger. Neighbors testified that they had seen Seeger in the woods, dancing with other women and cooking mysterious concoctions in black kettles. 2 of the suspects were subjected to the swimming test, in which their hands and feet were bound and they were cast into the water to test the theory that witches are unable to sink. After they were tried, the Greensmiths were indicted for not having the fear of God before thine eyes. Thou hast entertained familiarity with Satan, the grand enemy of God and mankind, and by his help hast acted things in a preternatural way. The court's verdict? According to the law of God and the established law of the Commonwealth, thou deserve to die. Rebecca Greensmith had confessed. Her husband, Nathaniel Greensmith, had protested his innocence, but they both met the same fate: death by hanging. Sanford was also sent to the gallows. Mary Barnes of Farmington, Connecticut, was swept up in the area's witch hunt and executed alongside the Greensmiths. Ann Cole reportedly regained her health after the executions. Goody Ayers fled Hartford, and she was never captured. Seeger, on the other hand, was finally convicted of witchcraft in 1665, but the governor reversed the verdict the following year. The 4 executions of suspected witches in Hartford were to be the last in Connecticut. Another hysteria broke out in Fairfield, Connecticut in 1692, but none of those convicted were put to death. Connecticut held its final witch trial in 1697, 50 years after Alice Young's initial execution. During that period, there were 46 prosecutions and at least 11 executions. Descendants of some of those 11 colonists are seeking posthumous pardons and apologies similar to those that occurred in Massachusetts for victims of the Salem witch trials. But Connecticut's Board of Pardons and Paroles has a policy not granting posthumous pardons. The descendants are now pressing for a gubernatorial proclamation to clear the names of their ancestors.
Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Or Daddy has to fight off a zombie herd. And once that zombie herd is dead, Daddy has to hack off the devil's head. And if that devil's head gets hacked, Daddy has to hunt down a werewolf pack. And when that werewolf pack goes down, Daddy has to slaughter an evil clown. And after the evil clown is killed, Daddy has to take on a vampire guild. So hush, little baby, don't you cry, or Daddy and the whole family will die.
Don't be afraid. Lock the doors. Turn out the lights and climb into bed. It's time for Hillbilly Deadtime Stories.
Not all of the dead can rest in peace. Sometimes spirits linger, haunting the overgrown paths that wind through old graveyards and spooking those who dare tread upon their bones. Walking through a hushed cemetery at night with only a flashlight to guide your way can be a stirring experience. A lot of paranormal societies use graveyards for training grounds. If you've got an EMF reading in a graveyard, there's no electricity there, so it has to be coming from some other source. Oftentimes, the spirits that you may encounter in a cemetery aren't kind or frightening, but rather full of grief in this final resting place. Oddly enough, a lot of cemeteries aren't that haunted. But that is not the case with Camp Chase Confederate Cemetery. It is said that a melancholy ghost haunts the rows at Camp Chase Confederate Cemetery on the west side of Columbus, Ohio. Known as the Lady in Gray, she usually weeps quietly over the grave of one Benjamin F. Allen, a private in the 50th Tennessee Regiment, Company D. Allen's grave is number 233 out of 2,260 Confederate soldiers laid to rest in the 2-acre plot in the capital city of this very northern state. The cemetery in Columbus's Hilltop neighborhood marks the place where a prisoner of war camp stood more than 140 years ago, though at the time the location was well outside the city limits. In May of 1861, a Union military training ground named Camp Jackson was established here. By July of that year, when the first prisoners were admitted, its name was changed to honor President Lincoln's Secretary of State and later Chief Justice of the United States, Hamilton County native Salmon P. Chase. At first, Camp Chase took only officers as prisoners, with enlisted men imprisoned at Fort Warren near Boston Harbor. A large number of the officers were captured during the 1862 Union victories at Fort Donelson, Tennessee, and Mississippi Island No. 10. But by the beginning of 1863, some 8,000 men of every rank were incarcerated behind the high-staked walls of the camp, necessitating the building of a stockade on Johnson's Island in Lake Erie. Most of the officers imprisoned at Camp Chase were transferred to Johnson's Island once the stockade was completed. During the smallpox epidemic of 1863, some 500 of the imprisoned soldiers died in the month of February alone. Overcrowding forced 2 and sometimes 3 men to share a single bunk, and it led to severe shortages in food, medicine, clothing, and even blankets. Malnourished and cold, the men were highly susceptible to disease. Near the end of that deadly year, a cemetery was built at the camp. As a result, the Confederate dead who had been buried in the city cemetery were moved back to Camp Chase, buried under a cheap wooden marker in a plot surrounded by a low fence. When the war ended in 1865, most of Camp Chase itself was dismantled. Some of the cabins where POWs had been housed were used as shanties for a few years, but for the most part, every trace of Camp Chase would soon be gone, except for the graveyard, which was left to deteriorate until it was restored and used as a gathering place for patriotic speeches in the 1890s. Today, the small cemetery is picturesque and well maintained. Its wooden headstones have been replaced with granite. Its centerpiece is an arch constructed from granite blocks. Atop the arch stands the statue of a Confederate soldier facing south, and on the keystone below his feet is engraved a single word: Americans. But who exactly is the Gray Lady? So many men died miserably here at a young age that it's surprising that the Lady in Gray is the only ghost who haunts the place. She is described by witnesses as wearing a flowing gray dress and a gray veil hiding her face. Is she Benjamin Allen's Tennessee bride, weeping over the reunion that never happened? Visitors to the cemetery and even those passing by gates have reported seeing the woman walking among the seemingly endless line of headstones. Once in a while, she is even seen walking through the locked cemetery gates at night. But more often than not, she's spotted standing over 2 specific graves, that of Benjamin Allen and one of an unknown soldier. Researchers of the paranormal have yet to figure out who the ghostly woman is and why she chooses to mourn where she does. She doesn't appear to be the spirit of any known relative of Mr. Allen's, and her concern for any unknown soldier further compounds the mystery. Perhaps the Lady in Gray isn't connected to these graves at all, but is simply eternally mourning the atrocities of war in general. Cemeteries have long been viewed as spooky, mostly due to the mysterious nature of death. Graveyards and tombs have provided the setting for countless tales of ghosts, devils, and crimes, leading many to fear cemeteries as haunted places filled with danger. The subject of death is uncomfortable to most people. Maybe, just maybe, the lady in gray will ease your anxiety about going to a cemetery.
Hush, little baby, don't say a word, or daddy has to fight off a zombie herd. And once that zombie herd is dead, daddy has to hack off the devil's head. And if that devil's head gets hacked, daddy has to hunt down a werewolf pack. And when that werewolf pack goes down, daddy has to slaughter an evil clown. And after the evil clown is killed, daddy has to take on a vampire guild. So hush, little baby, don't you cry, or daddy and the whole family will die.
Don't be afraid. Lock the doors. Turn out the lights and climb into bed. It's time for Hillbilly Deadtime Stories.
Poltergeist cases have been cited almost since the beginning of recorded history. The word poltergeist is German and it loosely translates to a noisy ghost. A poltergeist refers to phenomena usually credited to mischievous spirits or ghosts that are characterized by psychokinesis or even other physical manifestations. Although ghosts may be sometimes involved, most poltergeist incidents are kind of a psychic phenomena, usually centered around a living agent. In most cases, this living agent is actually a young girl going through puberty. This is usually combined with going through a turbulent time in her life, such as possibly a divorce. And that may be the case with today's subject, Juanette McNeil. In 1948, a disturbed teenager named Juanette McNeil moved in with her father. This was shortly after her parents divorced. They moved to a farm west of Macomb, Illinois, and Juanette was very unhappy living there. Her emotions were all over the place because of the bitter divorce, and she began to manifest strange poltergeist activity in the form of small fires that she set with her mind all over the farm. The first fire happened on August 7th on the farm of a man named Charles Willie. At the time, the residents of the farm included Willie, his wife, his brother-in-law, and Juanette's brother, Arthur McNeil, and McNeil's 2 children, Arthur Jr., who was 8, and Juanette, who had just recently turned 13. The very first fire began not as a blaze, but as a small brown spot that appeared on the wallpaper in the living room of the Willys farmhouse. That first spot was followed by another, and then another brown spot. The spots would appear, spread out several inches as they smoldered, and then, when they became hot enough, the spots burst into flames. Neighbors had to be called upon to come by the house and put out daily fires. Many of the neighbors stayed on the property, crowding into the house and even sleeping on the floor in an attempt to help keep watch over the situation. And soon, the fire chief was called in to launch an investigation. He had the Willys strip the wallpaper from their house, and the same brown spots then appeared on the bare plaster beneath, erupting into flames before dozens of witnesses. The front porch began to ignite along with the curtains in each room and one bed. Not even the National Fire Underwriters Laboratory, who were called in to investigate, knew why or how the fires were starting. It got to the point in which over 200 fires broke out, averaging 29 per day, and eventually an entire house was destroyed. Willie created a tarp home for his family, but the next day their barn burned down. Days later, the second barn burned down, along with other structures, and the family eventually fled. The U.S. Air Force even got involved as more fires broke out. Soon the farm was filled with over 1,000 people. They were made up of reporters and paranormal researchers and innocent onlookers. Eventually, Juanette was accused of starting the fires with simple kitchen matches. She confessed to the deputy fire marshal and said it was because she was unhappy and didn't like living on the farm. She missed her mother and had caused the fires to rebel. But that never explained the strange brown spots and how they turned into fires, or the fires that happened on the ceilings of buildings, even when Juanette was nowhere around. But the confession made everyone happy, and they closed the case, except for the hundreds of reporters and paranormal researchers who believed that Juanette was the human agent for the poltergeist phenomena. The fires eventually stopped. Juanette was taken to Chicago for examination at the Illinois Juvenile Hospital, but was found to be mentally normal by Dr. Sophie Schrader, a psychiatrist. "She's a nice little kid caught up in the middle of a broken home," she reported. She was later turned over to her grandmother, and she spent the rest of her teenage years with no further incidents. Everyone accepted that she was guilty of arson. Well, not quite everyone. One columnist from the Peoria newspaper, who had covered the case from the beginning, stated quite frankly that he did not believe the so-called confession. Neither did noted researcher The Unexplained Vincent Gaddis, who wrote about the case. He was convinced that the case was a perfect example of poltergeist phenomena. The insurance company eventually paid Mr. Willie for the damage done to his home, and the farm and farmhouse was later rebuilt. Not surprisingly, the case is still listed as unexplained.
Hush, little baby, don't say a word, or Daddy has to fight off a zombie herd. And once that zombie herd is dead, Daddy has to hack off the devil's head. And if that devil's head gets hacked, Daddy has to hunt down a werewolf pack. And when that werewolf pack goes down, Daddy has to slaughter an evil clown. And after the evil clown is killed, Daddy has to take on a vampire guild. So hush, little baby, don't you cry, or Daddy and the whole family will die.
Don't be afraid. Lock the doors. Turn out the lights and climb into bed. It's time for Hillbilly Deadtime Stories.
Some universities are said to have been built on ancient burial sites. Others were apparently the scenes of tragic suicides and unexpected deaths. It's probably little wonder then that so many college campuses are supposedly haunted. Taking in everything from possessed paintings to mischief-making poltergeists, haunted college ghost legends are as varied as they are chilling. What's more, while some schools seem to shrug off the alleged haunted histories, others actively embrace the reputations they have for all things paranormal. Students, meanwhile, have turned the humble ghost story into a campus institution, and tales are enthusiastically passed down from each generation of freshmen to the next. One of those campuses that embrace the paranormal is Penn State University. Penn State University is a multi-campus institution with campuses and affiliate facilities located throughout the state. The main campus was established in 1855 in rural University Park area and boasts approximately 50,000 students, with an additional 50,000 at satellite campuses. It is considered one of the most prestigious learning institutions in the country, if not the world, and it's riddled with ghosts. The main campus alone is notoriously haunted, spawning the university's own paranormal research group on the site, the Paranormal Research Society, which has over 40 members. The paranormal activity at Penn is so common and commonly known that there are tours on campus, especially at Halloween, and the hauntings have become a fixed part of the college culture. Undoubtedly, the most widely known spirit is that of the school's first mascot, a mule named Old Coley, born in 1855, the same year that Penn State traditionally observes as the date that it was founded. Students report the sounds of his hooves clip-clopping across the campus, and they hear his distinct brays. The Schwab Auditorium is particularly active, with students reporting chairs that move up and down with no one touching them, flickering lights, and the frequent apparition of 3 different ghosts, including the former janitor. In fact, Charles Schwab, the former industrialist whom the auditorium was named, is said to be one of the ghosts. He was a former Penn State trustee and he funded construction of the auditorium, as he was a huge supporter of the arts. And apparently, he likes to stick around and watch the performances in the small 900-seat auditorium. The auditorium also has a female spirit, objects that move across the floor on their own, and the sound of noises echoing from the upper floors. When students go to investigate, there is no one there. Another famously haunted site on the campus is the old Botany building situated along Pollock Road. It is a simple building but houses quite a bit of ghostly activity, at least according to the students and researchers who visited the red brick cottage. The ghost of Frances Atherton, the wife of former university president George Atherton, is said to haunt the structure. She is often spotted looking out an upper floor window across the street to the cemetery where George is buried. Because the walkway past the building is so busy, there have been numerous reports of Frances standing, looking anxiously out, not even noticing the parade of students below. Luckily, the many ghosts of Penn State are generally said to be friendly, or at least neutral, but they make for a great late-night conversation on dark and stormy nights around the campus. The Campus Ghost Walk allows new students to see and hear the legendary stories of Penn State's paranormal reputation, while at the same time locating the hotspots that they may wish to visit later or avoid altogether. Mont Alto's Weisling Hall is the oldest building in the Penn State complex. It was built in 1807. It has functioned over the years as a dorm, a dining hall, classrooms, administrative offices, and home to at least 2 different ghosts. The ghosts are said to be those of Colonel George Weisling himself, who built the manor with money that he earned from the iron trade, and that of a woman named Sarah Matheny, who was murdered nearby in 1911. Students who have roomed or dined there over the years report phantom footsteps and rapping on doors, and those who had the courage to investigate the building claimed their batteries would quickly drain and die. Penn State Abington is reportedly haunted by a fairly well-known ghost, the spirit of Amelia Earhart, who was a student there and would often climb out the Sutherland Building's roof at night just to look at the stars. That's when the building was known as the Ogantz School for Young Ladies. Students today often claim to hear loud footsteps above on the roof. When they investigate, there's no one there. They believe that it's Amelia's ghost going up to see the stars that she loved so much. Penn State Wilkes-Barre was founded in 1916 to train engineers for the bustling coal industry. A family of coal barons, the Cunninghams, donated their majestic home, Hayfield Farms, to Penn State University for its new campus. The father, John Cunningham, is said to have died falling down the home's elevator shaft, and now he haunts the campus building, slamming doors and making all kinds of noises when no one's around. Others say that the ghost of his wife, Bertha, also walks around making sure that the students respect the building and keep it clean. Penn State Hazleton is a 125-acre former estate called High Acres in the small town of Hazleton. It was once the home of a wealthy family, the Markles, who many believe now haunt Schiavo Hall. Night staff and late-night studying students hear a host of strange, unexplained noises. At Penn State University, you may go for the prestigious education, or possibly because of the football team's tradition, but you will stay for the ghosts.
Hush, little baby, don't say a word, or daddy has to fight off a zombie herd. And once that zombie herd is dead, daddy has to hack off the devil's head. And if that devil's head gets hacked, daddy has to hunt down a werewolf pack. And when that werewolf pack goes down, daddy has to slaughter an evil clown. And after the evil clown is killed, daddy has to take on a vampire. vampire guild. So hush, little baby, don't you cry, or daddy and the whole family will die.
Don't be afraid. Lock the doors. Turn out the lights and climb into bed. It's time for Hillbilly Deadtime Stories.
Bleak mansions and somber castles usually spring to mind when we think of haunted places. But ghostly phenomena, whatever the cause, can manifest in crumbling, abandoned buildings as well as well-lit, modern offices, even libraries. Haunted libraries seem to fall into two types. First, there is the building with a reputation, where a convenient murder, curse, or other tragedies occurred. Library staff can then blame the odd noise, or the occasional book falling off the shelf, or even glitches in the air conditioning on the resident ghost. No one reports anything too spooky, and the children's librarians have a good time with it at story hour. Secondly, though, there are libraries where credible, responsible people observe strange human shapes, hear disembodied voices, and witness other classic paranormal phenomena. Plausible explanations about how the building must be settling ring about as hollow as those mysterious footsteps late at night on the upper floorboards. The library staff learns to live with its ghost, usually by accepting the paranormal activity as normal working conditions. The Willard Library in Evansville, Indiana is so known for its hauntings that it even has its own ghost cam that you can log on to 24 hours a day. So just who haunts the Willard Library? Housed in a grand Victorian Gothic building, the oldest public library building in Indiana certainly looks the role of the premier haunted library in all of the United States. Some call it a quote-unquote living, breathing haunted house. So prominent is the ghost of Willard Library that the local newspaper installed perhaps the only ghost cameras in a public building anywhere. Several of the library's rooms are outfitted with stationary video cameras that can be accessed via the internet. The picture changes every few seconds, allowing a viewer the opportunity to participate in a sort of stop-motion ghost hunting expedition throughout the library. This is a quote from an Associated Press article written by James Pritchard on October 31, 1999. On a cold winter morning in 1937, a janitor grabbed his flashlight and headed down into the pitch-black basement of the Willard Library to stoke the coal furnace. But then, he was stopped in his tracks by the ghostly vision of a woman dressed in gray, from the veil covering her face down to her shoes. Since then, a number of Willard staff members have reported seeing the shadow Lady in Gray, or witnessing weird happenings among the shelves. That janitor back in 1937 never did get the coal shoveled. He was so astounded at the sudden appearance of this pale lady who seemed to glow in the dark that he hastily scooped up his flashlight and ran out of the building, never to return, according to the story. Named after local philanthropist Willard Carpenter, the Willard Library is near downtown Evansville. It was placed on a National Register of Historic Places in 1972. According to library history, the Willard's Lady in Gray appearances and near appearances have been plentiful over the years. Margaret M. Meyer worked in the library for over 40 years from her high school graduation in 1937 until 1980. The children's room was one of the locations of the ghost camera. It was renamed in her honor. She claimed that the lady in gray followed her home one night when the children's room was undergoing renovation. Miss Meyer and her sister felt an unseen presence in their home and several times were enveloped in a sudden chill. The strong scent of perfume also attended the lady's visit to the Meyers. That same pungent odor of perfume abruptly swept over two members of the local genealogy group working on cemetery records in the library's research room. Experts say that ghost sightings are sometimes accompanied by the scent of flowers or by perfume. Betty Elaine Miller, a longtime Willard employee, was the head librarian from 1972 to 1975. Her work often required her to stay after hours. One evening at her desk, she heard water running from somewhere on the second floor. She rushed up the stairs to discover a faucet in the bathroom had been turned on. Sometime later, another librarian using the same bathroom saw a faucet slowly turn on all by itself. The apparition of the Gray Lady appears and vanishes so quickly that it's been difficult to affix an identity to her. Yet so many librarians and patrons report seeing her that there seems to be little doubt among believers that a ghost does indeed live at the library. But who, in fact, might this persistent library spirit be? The prime candidate seems to be Louise Carpenter, the embittered daughter of the library's benefactor, Willard Carpenter. Louise unsuccessfully sued the library's board of trustees at the time of its construction. She claimed that her father was of unsound mind and was unduly influenced in establishing the library. There isn't any explanation of what she meant by this ambiguous accusation. Many believe that she has returned to the library that she objected to in life and will stay in residence until the property is returned to the living descendants of Willard Carpenter. The Evansville Courier and Press worked with the library to install the ghost cameras. They became so successful and so widely viewed that what began as a temporary Halloween promotion has now turned into a permanent attempt to capture on video a visit by the Lady in Gray. The original camera was in the Willard's research room because this is where many of the first sightings had occurred. A second was then installed on a high bookshelf in the children's room. Another camera is in the basement not far from where the janitor had his first recorded encounter with the ghost some 85 years ago. This last camera can be moved right and left by remote control for a more sweeping view of the area. An editor at the old newspaper told the Associated Press reporter that the cameras have been very popular with internet users. There have been enough unusual incidents to make him something of a believer. One of the bookshelf-mounted cameras was found one morning inexplicably turned in the opposite direction from the day before. Employees deny touching the camera. Several 100,000 hits have been recorded on the website. Viewers are invited to share their comments and share any pictures of which they think detect a ghost. Some of the ghost images are fuzzy and easily dismissed as optical illusions or distortions. Others, however, are more difficult to write off. The children's room seems to be one of the more popular sites based on their responses from the ghost cam enthusiasts. A viewer from Amsterdam enclosed a picture in which a child is staring intently through a doorway, beyond which there seems to be a hazy figure. The child is clearly looking at the figure with anxiety and fright. The woman named Andrea wrote, "When I zoomed in, the spirit was holding a book as if she was reading to the child. I thought this was a parent, but colors were missing." In another image, a figure appears to be crouching in the same doorway. A hooded figure peers over the bookshelf in another captured picture forwarded by a viewer. The research room also has its share of possible sightings. The faint likeness of a woman seems to be sitting at the end of one of the tables. The internet viewer of this image said, "I saw the Gray Lady. I was looking at the site with my brother and spotted her. It was on screen. When it refreshed twice, then she was gone." Another ghost cam user circled a hazy yet distinct object that does indeed appear to be a candle. She said, "I'm not sure what this is, but on the first table, second chair to the left, I think I see the faint image of a candle, or something. I don't know if my mind is just playing tricks or what." Another viewer circled in blue what may possibly be a seated figure bending over the table holding something in its hand. I saw this on Friday, October 25th, 2002. It seems to me that there's something sitting at the table holding a writing instrument. Although Louise Carpenter objected to the library's construction, her ghost might be more accepting. A digital enhanced image from the ghost cam seems to show the ghost returning a book to the proper shelf. Since there is little chance that the library property will revert to Carpenter heirs, the lady in gray, if it is indeed Louise Carpenter, may be doomed to wander among the bookshelves for decades to come.
Hush, little baby, don't say a word, or Daddy has to fight off a zombie herd. And once that zombie herd is dead, Daddy has to hack off the devil's head. And if that devil's head gets hacked, Daddy has to hunt down a werewolf pack. And when that werewolf pack goes down, Daddy has to slaughter an evil clown. And after the evil clown is killed, Daddy has to take on a vampire guild. So hush, little baby, don't you cry, or Daddy and the whole family will die.
Don't be afraid. Lock the doors. Turn out the lights and climb into bed. It's time for Hillbilly Deadtime Stories.
We've all heard the stories of haunted movie sets. The Poltergeist franchise was plagued by several of the actors dying during or shortly after the completion of the movie that they were in. Actress Heather O'Rourke died at the age of 12 from an intestinal blockage before Poltergeist 3 was even completed. Some blame the Poltergeist curse on the fact that Steven Spielberg used real skeletons in the pool scene. He didn't think that the artificial skeletons looked real enough, and quite frankly, the real ones were cheaper. Another of the more popular cursed movies was The Omen. Several strange occurrences happened to the cast members as well. The strange occurrences with this movie started even before filming started. Actor Gregory Peck, the star of the film, had to deal with his son's suicide right before filming began. Shortly after that, Gregory Peck was bound for London on a plane that was struck by lightning. 2 weeks later, executive Mark Newfield's plane was also struck by lightning. These are just a few of the examples from the film. No film, though, has ever had the reputation of being as cursed as The Exorcist. You've probably heard most of these stories. On-set accidents, a mysterious fire, and even a murder took place during the filming of the movie. All of these things gave cause for people to believe that The Exorcist was cursed. And while you've heard most of these stories, you may not have heard the story of John Markle, but you won't soon forget it. In the bright light of day, the gray Victorian house that sits on the hill above Main Street in Little Rock, Arkansas, looks like any other nicely restored home in the historic Governor's Mansion District. The rounded shrubs bordering the porch along the front and the side show the care taken with the home's appearance, while a basketball goal in the backyard suggests someone who lives there likes to play. Nothing hints that 1820 Main Street was the site of a bizarre, horror movie-worthy crime 33 years ago that resulted in the deaths of 4 people. What occurred there shocked the city and prompted extensive speculation and media coverage. Today, it's a faint memory in the public's consciousness, although the deaths of John L. Markle, his wife Christina, and 2 young daughters have all the elements of a true crime novel or made-for-TV movie. Markle, 45 years old, was a depressed, angry man eaten up with bitterness toward his mother, Academy Award winner Mercedes McCambridge, whose approval he wanted desperately. He moved his family to Arkansas in 1979 when he was hired by Stevens Inc. as an economist and a futures trader and was trusted with the accounts of the company's founders. Markle was also responsible for his mother's investments. The family created a life in the community. The girls attended public schools, and Markle's mother moved to Little Rock to be near her son. To all outward appearances, they were a normal, happy family. But the tragedy that unfolded in the early hours of November 16, 1987, shattered that image and brought Markle's personal and professional secrets and his inner turmoil into the light of public scrutiny. A thunderstorm raged throughout the night as Christina and daughters Amy Michelle, 13, and Suzanne Marie, 9, slept on the second and third floors of their home. At 2:30 a.m., Markle put on a Halloween mask, went upstairs, and systematically killed his family. Afterward, he phoned his attorney, Richard Lawrence, and asked him to come by his house. When Lawrence arrived at 4:15 a.m., accompanied by a Little Rock police officer, the house was dark except for a light glowing in a downstairs window. Finding the front door unlocked, the officer went inside and discovered Markle dead in his downstairs study. Lying beside him were 2 pistols, as well as a blood-splattered old man Halloween mask with a bald head, bushy eyebrows, hooked nose, beard, and mustache. A 3rd pistol was found in the upstairs bedroom. The officer found 45-year-old Christina dead in the 3rd floor master suite. Amy and Suzanne were dead together in one bed in a 2nd floor bedroom. Later, police officers concluded that Markle shot his wife 3 times, Amy 4 times, and Suzanne 5 times. It was also assumed by police officers that the 2 girls were in the same bed due to one being scared from the thunderstorm. There were no reports of the shootings from neighbors, most assuming that it was probably the sound of thunder. On the desk in the study, there was a handwritten suicide note bearing the date and time, 11/16/87 at 2:30 a.m., and it was signed by Markle. The note read as follows: "Let it hereby be stated as true that I, John L. Markle, murdered my wife and 2 children, Amy and Suzanne, and then committed suicide myself. My wife had no knowledge or part in this. I think the evidence shall so provide." After calling his attorney, Markle shot himself in the head simultaneously with the 2 guns found beside him. He left a black briefcase with a note saying that it was for Lawrence. Inside were 2 letters to Lawrence, a handwritten will that mentioned neither his wife nor his daughters, a 12-page letter to his mother, 64 $100 bills, a $5,000 money order, and assorted personal papers. The letter to his famous mother immediately captured the media's attention. McCambridge won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actress for 1949's All the King's Men. But what resonated eerily for those reading news accounts about her son's crime was that in 1973, she had provided the voice of the demon-possessed child in The Exorcist. Details that came to light after the tragedy further added to the horror movie feel that surrounded it. The Friday before Markle killed his family, Stevens Inc. fired him for embezzling and mismanaging funds. The date was Friday the 13th. Then there was the Halloween mask, the acrimonious letter to his mother, the coincidence that a video of A Nightmare on Elm Street was found in the VCR, and the connection to The Exorcist. There was never any doubt that Markle committed the murders before killing himself. Why he wanted to commit suicide was evident after the circumstances of his firing were revealed. But despite all that's known about the case, why he also killed his wife and daughter seemed not only cruel and selfish, but also senseless. What made Markle decide that they would be better off dead? What pushes a father to kill his family? In this case, money and mommy issues drove a man to kill. John Markle's handwritten suicide note, signed and dated 11/16/87 at 2:30 a.m., left no doubt that he killed his wife and daughters in their home at 1820 Main Street in Little Rock, Arkansas, before shooting himself in the head. But it didn't explain why. Letters The Economist and futures trader left for his attorney and mother revealed his inner turmoil, the anger and the depression he suffered after being fired by Stevens Inc. for embezzling and mismanaging funds. Notes in his diary show that he was worried about his wife, Christina, and daughters, Amy Michelle and Suzanne Marie. "I am broke and they are my children. They have no inheritance because of my actions," Markle wrote in the diary 3 weeks before his death. "Christine says I have put my family last, and I have." On the night of the killings, 45-year-old Markle put on a creepy Halloween mask before shooting his sleeping family in their beds. The rubber mask, in retrospect, seems in character for a man known for his idiosyncrasies, such as wearing a leather Harley-Davidson cap to his white-collar job. He owned a Lincoln, but sometimes drove a battered pickup truck that he and his girls had painted wild colors. Forensic psychologists cite numerous reasons why fathers take their families with them into death, among them loss of control over family circumstances, a belief that the children can't survive without them, and feeling overwhelmed and seeing no way out of the current adversity. Markle's life unraveled in the weeks before the murders. In October 1987, his employers placed him on medical leave, but local media outlets uncovered the real reason: discrepancies in financial accounts belonging to Stevens Inc. and his movie star mother, Mercedes McCambridge. On November 13, 1987, 3 days before the murders, Stevens fired Markle. He had made investments for his mother and the company without revealing which were his mother's and which belonged to Stevens. When an investment was profitable, Markle put the credit on the McCambridge's account. Losses were assigned to Stevens' in-house account. Those losses totaled $5.2 million. There was no evidence that McCambridge knew what was going on. After being placed on leave, Markle came up with 2 plans for making restitution to Stevens Inc., both of which required his mother's cooperation. But she wouldn't play. McCambridge's refusal to agree to either plan angered and frustrated her son, apparently adding to his bitterness about what he saw as a lifetime of indifference and affronts by his mother. In a 12-page letter that Markle left for McCambridge, along with a letter to his lawyer, 64 $100 bills, and other documents, he detailed his grievances. He wrote about growing up as a movie star's son and staying with other relatives and seeing his mother drunk and fighting with other co-stars. The letter revealed his desire for his mother's attention. Markle lamented that when he won several awards at college, his mother never seemed to notice. In none of the letters and notes in the Little Rock Police Department's investigative files, ordered released by the state Supreme Court in 1989, did Markle detail directly why he decided to kill his wife and daughters. However, the fact that he avoided a will executed in 1985, then replaced it with one handwritten and dated November 9th, indicated he had apparently made up his mind a week before the murder-suicide. The new will made no provisions for his wife and family. Steve Nowaczki, Pulaski County coroner at the time of the murders, offered a theory in 1987 for Markle's crime. It was an act of macabre benevolence. He wanted to spare the girls the publicity. Arkansas business editor Gwen Moritz, who has studied the Markle case in depth and read every document in the investigative files, said Markle seemed to be trying to make sure the assets of his estate and life insurance policies went to pay off Stevens' debt. He believed he was punishing his mother and settling his debt at the same time. Moritz said, "I think this was a really sad and psychological study of a guy whose mother was highly accomplished and he really tried to please her. He and his family paid the ultimate price for his obsession with that."
Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Or daddy, I has to fight off a zombie herd. And once that zombie herd is dead, Daddy has to hack off the devil's head. And if that devil's head gets hacked, Daddy has to hunt down a werewolf pack. And when that werewolf pack goes down, Daddy has to slaughter an evil clown. And after the evil clown is killed, Daddy has to take on a vampire guild. So hush, little baby, don't you cry, or Daddy and the whole family will die.
Don't be afraid. Lock the doors. Turn out the lights and climb into bed. It's time for Hillbilly Deadtime Stories.
Very few thoughts can conjure up more fear and anxiety than being abducted by aliens. The horror stories described by abductees such as Travis Walton and Barney and Betty Hill are the thoughts that will keep you awake, quivering in your bed at night. Even with high-profile cases such as these on record, there are still several people who do not believe in the existence of life outside of the Earth, let alone UFOs or abductions. This is mainly due to a lack of solid evidence to convince the strongest of skeptics. That being said, the events in January 1976 in Stanford, Kentucky, involving 3 women is one of the most credible abduction cases in UFO annals worldwide. This is primarily due to the physical evidence, animal reaction, electromagnetic effects, and the investigation. The event was fully reported, researched, and followed up on. If you are one of those people who do not believe in UFOs or abduction, you just might be a believer after tonight. January 6, 1976. It was Mona Stafford's 36th birthday. She was joined by her best friends Louise Smith and Elaine Thomas for a celebratory dinner at Redwood Restaurant. Redwood Restaurant was located south of Lancaster, Kentucky, 35 miles from their hometown of Liberty. The 3 had a great time without the benefit of alcoholic beverages. After dinner, they started what they thought would be a normal drive back home. They had no way of knowing the events that would soon transpire. Events that they would never forget. They left the restaurant at 11:15 p.m. The 3 women piled into the 1967 Chevy Nova driven by Louise Smith. Leaving Stanford and heading for Houstonville on Highway 78, the 3 suddenly see a bright red object in the clear night sky. Mona was the first to see the object. She assumed it was an airplane which was on fire and about to crash. As the craft got closer, the car suddenly sped up on its own. The car accelerated to 85 miles per hour. In a panic, Louise screams, "I can't hold the car on the road." Mona reached over and tried to help her, thinking that something was wrong with the steering, but she could not control it either. The car continued on its high rate of speed without Louise's foot even on the gas pedal. The object was now incredibly close to the car. It followed from behind for a short time, then flipped on its end and came to the driver's side. All 3 women would describe the craft the same way, an enormous metallic disc-shaped object with a dome on top. with a ring of red lights around its midsection. All three women also noticed a yellow blinking light on the bottom of the craft. After a few minutes of hovering over the driver's side of the car, it took off down the highway, causing a bluish-white light to shoot into the car, illuminating the interior of the vehicle. Louise would later describe the inside of their car as filled with a haze-like air, sort of like a fog. Instantly, all three women suffered from a burning sensation so strong that they could not open their eyes. The last thing that Smith, Stafford, and Thomas remembered was being backed into a pasture entrance in a quote-unquote crazy manner. 1 hour and 20 minutes later, the three found themselves back in the car, driving toward Liberty. They were shaken and tense, with exposed areas of flesh, painful from the burns. The three frightened and scared ladies finally arrived at Louise Smith's home, and when they entered, they noticed that the clock in the kitchen showed 1:20 a.m., meaning that the trip of 35 miles that would normally take 45 minutes had taken just over 2 hours. After confirming the time with their neighbor, they called the police station. Unfortunately, the police informed them that there was absolutely nothing that they could do. The following morning, they phoned the Navy recruiting station. The Navy station reported the call to a Lexington television station. The story quickly reached the press and was given headline status. Investigator Jerry Black from MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, heard the story and started researching the event. Black called the three women and asked for an interview, but none of the three were eager to relive the event or to have strangers in their homes. After multiple phone calls and offering sympathy for their experience, the three finally agreed to an interview. Black invited Peggy Schnell of Ohio, who had experience with these kinds of cases, to also attend. Black felt that the three would feel more comfortable with a female accompanying him on the trip. In the first meeting, several very important facts were revealed. Black stated that the three women were all obviously in physical pain. They had insatiable thirst, and they all claimed excessive weight loss since the event. The three women gave some details of their observations of the UFO, its structure, and its behavior. They also discussed some of the ill effects that they had sustained. These memories were painful to all three as they tried to recall details in hopes that someone might be able to help them. Elaine Thomas said, "We live in fear of what we don't know. I'm worried about Louise and Mona. I think they're ready for a breakdown." There were some psychological problems caused by the experience. Louise Smith was having difficulties in performing her everyday duties as an assistant for the Casey County Extensive Office. Mona Stafford was not only suffering from her eye inflammation, she also wanted to know what happened during her missing time. Several things were evident to the investigators at the first meeting. The three witnesses were sincere about what they had experienced. They were suffering from the so-called beam, and there were obvious physical scars from the encounter. Louise Smith lifted her hair up, and she showed a mark on her neck. It was a roundish, pinkish gray blotch the size of a $50. Another unusual revelation that came out from the meeting was the strange reaction of Louise's parakeet. When Louise first arrived home after the experience, instead of her usual happy greeting, she received a frightening reaction from the bird. It flew into the side of its cage and fluttered its wings in a wild display of fear. Louise proclaimed that since the first night home, her pet has had nothing to do with her. Tests were conducted on other birds. When other people came near the birds, the reactions were perfectly normal. But when Louise came too close, they too panicked. Her pet parakeet died in March of 1976, just 3 months after the encounter. But this was far from the only strange occurrences Louise would notice. The minute hand on her wristwatch began to rapidly spin around. Also the next week after the sighting, when she touched her bedroom alarm clock, it quit working. Her car then developed electrical problems. Driving to work, she was stopped by the police, who informed her that her signal lights were no longer working. All three women suffered from extreme weakness. Because of this, the investigators agreed that at least for the time being, no details of the event would be released. After the initial interviews, the investigators were convinced that the three women's story was as solid as could be. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that these three well-respected, mature, sane women had seen something that they did not understand, and that there was missing time that had to be explored. An abduction seemed to be the obvious choice amongst the investigators. Dr. Leo Sprinkle was called upon to perform regressive hypnosis on the three. Sprinkle was a well-respected ufologist and a physician. When Smith, Stafford, and Thomas were contacted about Sprinkle's desire to help them, they initially refused, not knowing of Sprinkle's reputation. At this time, the three women, though needing help, were still under the impression that in time that their problems would pass, and to involve more and more people in the story would only prolong the agony. A promise was made to the three ladies that the regressive hypnosis procedure and its results would not be released to any of the UFO groups for publication until a time that they felt comfortable with it. A date was set for the regressive hypnosis for March 7, 1976. Dr. Sprinkle, Black, Snell, and others were all present for the initial session. At this time, only one of the three would consent to the hypnosis, Mona Stafford. A silence fell across the room as Dr. Sprinkle began to place Monica in a hypnotic state. In a slow, cautious manner, Stafford began to recall the events of that evening. She was able to relive the thought of an airplane crashing. She was not able to go any further at this first session as tears rolled down her cheeks and exhaustion set in. After the first hypnosis session, Black continued to ask questions of Louise and Elaine. Mona moved away from the others to rest. Another interviewer began to show Stafford some drawings of aliens. The word alien had not even been mentioned in the case before this time, out of respect for the three and also not to coach them in any way. Mona sat and silently looked at the pictures, and then in a dramatic fashion she proclaimed, "That looks like the light I saw. It was shaped like that head," pointing to a specific alien. Again, Mona sat for a time, thinking about that night. Then she added to her previous statement, "Yes, I can see the face now, but it doesn't seem solid. It comes and goes. It fades and reappears like in a fog. Its eyes are far apart, and at the bottom, the chin. It's like the drawing." At this time, she had remembered all that she could, but that was more than enough. A major breakthrough had occurred. The time-lapse barrier had been breached. There was now no doubt that an abduction had taken place. Several months went by without probing any deeper into the hidden facts of the case. Investigators did keep in constant touch with the three women, albeit in a friendly fashion, careful not to push them too soon. The three women were still locked in fear. Their physical problems continued, and so did the weight loss. The next hypnosis session was scheduled for the Brown Motel in Liberty, Kentucky on June 23, 1976. Newly present at this meeting was well-known UFO investigator Bob Pratt of the National Enquirer. Though the reputation of the Enquirer left much to be desired, Pratt himself was regarded as an honest, sincere man. The first order of the business on this day would be lie detector testing. A detective for the Lexington Police Department, James Young, was hired to head the polygraph part of the session. Recognized as an expert in the field, Young began testing each of the three women individually. Young was actually a great choice for the sessions because he was a skeptic as far as UFO stories went. The tests themselves were lengthy, leaving no room for anything but a conclusive result, whether good or bad. After the tests were completed, Young emerged from the room with an expression of utter amazement. All three of the women had breezed through their tests without a hint of deception. To his credit, Young was man enough to admit that the earlier prejudices were completely erased after the testing of the three women. Later that evening, Dr. Sprinkle would put Louise Smith under hypnosis. The next day, all three women would undergo regression, with each woman having 2 sessions. During the regressions, the faces of all three women showed the emotional turmoil that they were enduring. The details of what occurred on the harrowing night came slowly, hauntingly, and painfully. Some of the most fearful moments of their abduction were displayed by the painful body contortions and movements. All of the details were observed by eyewitnesses of the entire procedure whose credibility is beyond question. All of the women were taken aboard some type of craft and subjected to physical examinations, sometimes harsh, sometimes torturous. There was not any sexual contact during the abduction, but they were restrained in embarrassing and humiliating positions. Louise Smith would reveal that her exam took place on a table. Elaine Thomas's was inside of a capsule with an unusual-looking noose-like device around her neck, which tightened painfully if she tried to speak. Mona Stafford's exam was in a chair-like device. All of the abductees recalling having their bodies scanned with instruments used which exerted pressure on their limbs. Louise Thomas recalled a tube with a bullet-like tip on it, which probed her chest. She also recalled a warm liquid being applied to her face and body. Mona Stafford also recalled the warm liquid. The sessions brought out other details as well. The characteristics of the alien forms themselves seemed to be vague and often indescribable. All three related shadowy figures which floated or glided by them. They also recalled the frightening one eye or two eyes which also hovered above them. Mona made an unusual statement in describing an eye exam. I could see a light at the end of a tunnel, which looked like a volcano with a jagged edge. At this point, she described great pain in her eyes, just like they'd been pulled out. Mona recalled a single bright purple eye that radiated lightning-like rays. Elaine also joined the other two in describing the strange events. She remembered two eyes from a round head in a deep darkness. One eye, she said, was a beautiful blue, encircled by a blue membranous lid like a turtle's, and the other eye appeared dark. Louise saw several different types of beings during her ordeal, but she was so frightened that she closed her eyes and didn't look at them. However, some months later, she described her vision of humanoids in a similar fashion to her two friends, adding that their hands looked like jagged wingtips. It would be Elaine who recalled the most about their captors, at one point stating there were several small figures about 4 feet tall. One fact that all three agreed on was that the humanoids communicated with them by telepathy. Not once was an entity mentioned to have any type of mouth. Some interesting facts about the craft itself were revealed by Mona Stafford when asked to elaborate on her description of the tunnel or volcano. She would now add to the previous information that she was looking through a tunnel with a room lit up brightly. She could see a square table with a helpless woman on it, surrounded by small figures clad in white. The small beings were closely examining the poor woman. In her own words, "I'm not sure if the person was Elaine or Louise, or maybe even me." After all of the revelations of the three women, there remained no doubt that something very extraordinary happened on the night of Mona's birthday. The Stanford, Kentucky abduction is still considered one of the best documented abduction cases in UFO history.
Don't be afraid. Lock the doors. Turn out the lights and climb into bed. It's time for Hillbilly Deadtime Stories.
Over the years, haunted houses have inspired generations of writers, artists, and filmmakers and captured the imaginations of people of all ages in every part of the world. By examining the history of these supernatural residences, we can gain a fascinating insight into the identity of their otherworldly inhabitants. In the history of any place, there is sadness as well as joy. People are born, they live, they die. And among all the living are weddings, birthdays, and anniversaries. There are also arguments and conflicts. Intertwined in these events are emotions. Speculation has been made that a house haunted is a house that retains energy and emotion from past events. The house we will learn about today is in Georgia, just off the beaten path. This house could not escape that fate, nor could it hide its hauntings from those who later dwelt there. The house stood back from the road, sheltered by tall oaks with a view of the world from the front porch. It was not an imposing structure, just a dwelling of generations of farmers, but it had a long history. The core of the house was a log cabin built before the Native Americans were driven from the area in the 1830s. As the owners became more prosperous, they replaced many of the rustic features of the home with more refined materials. The Owens family moved here one summer to escape the hustle and the bustle of the big city of Atlanta. They were looking for the tranquility of a rural area and were excited when their real estate agents showed them the old farmhouse. The house needed many improvements, but they were looking forward to the challenge. They wanted to make the house their own, to change it to their liking, to bond with it as if they had built it. They had elaborate plans and started renovations almost immediately. First, the kitchen had to go. It was old and antiquated, and honestly, just ugly. They started ripping things out, never realizing that at one time the things they ripped out had been someone else's idea of a dream. Pine cabinets, formica tops, large enamel range, stainless steel sink, all taken to the dump, gone. And that's when it started. At first, it was just things misplaced. Tools, clothes, books. The new residents hardly noticed until they were looking for these possessions and found them in odd places. Screwdrivers would be found driven among the roots of an old oak tree in the backyard. Clothes would be found in the corner in the back of the closet, wound up into a tight ball. And for some odd reason, books would turn up in the loft of the barn. At first, the family was charmed. They felt honored to have a ghost in their house. The tools were still usable, the clothes could be ironed, and the barn loft was an excellent place to read. But the fire in the smokehouse, that changed their minds. The parents immediately suspected one of the children. Children like to play with matches, and they rarely own up to their guilt. Of course, the children denied any knowledge of the fire in the old smokehouse. The parents assumed that they just did not want to be punished. The second fire was a lot more perplexing. When this fire started, the children were away at a public swimming pool. The shed that burnt down had never been explored because of weeds and fear of snake. The shed and its contents were burnt to ash. If any valuable contents were inside, the family would never know. School began about the time that the kitchen was finished, and not only did the children start classes, but the mother did as well. She traveled south to a small 2-year college with a good horticulture program. She hoped that the following year that they would have a spectacular flower bed and garden. With the rest of the family away, Mr. Owens went to work on the only bathroom in the house. He rented a portable toilet and ripped out the bathroom to its bare walls. As usual, there were misplaced pools and even a small fire in the barn. Despite this, the bathroom was finished in time for a Halloween party. New friends and old friends came to the party, and all about 100 people drove up to the jack-o'-lantern-lined driveway and parked in the field beside the house. Festivities would include games, a hayride, and of course, ghost stories. Among the guests was a local man who was renowned for his ghost stories. The Owens family shared stories about the strange happenings since they moved in, and the local man confirmed their assumptions about the house being haunted with a few stories of his own about the house. He claimed that there was not just one ghost, but several. When the evening ended, the local man was one of the last to go. He thanked the family for having him out, but then he said something odd before he left. "You'll start seeing them soon," he said, and the family nervously laughed this off. Having pranks played on you by unseen ghosts was one thing, but actually seeing those pranksters, that was something that they did not look forward to. Unfortunately, the sightings started to happen all too soon. Left alone, Mr. Owens worked inside and outside the house, but he began to feel as if he was not really alone. He suspected that someone was watching him, and he did not like that feeling. It was like a subtle invasion of his privacy. When he got fed up with his suspicions, Mr. Owens started looking for a logical explanation. He suspected one of his neighbors. Since he never saw anything, except for sometimes out of the corner of his eye, Mr. Owens decided he was letting his imagination run wild. But the woman in calico changed his mind. He first saw her near the barn, and at the time he thought she was one of the neighbors come to visit or just taking a walk. When he waved to her, she just stared. Feeling embarrassed, he went back to chopping wood. Looking up again, she was gone. The second time, he was in the kitchen enjoying a mid-morning coffee break while reading the gardening section of the Sunday paper. He happened to glance out of the window as he was putting his mug down on the table when he saw her again. She was standing just outside the barn, but this time she was not alone. She had a child with her, a boy. Getting a better look at her this time, Mr. Owen saw that she had wispy blonde hair. The boy's was almost the same, and he wore overalls without a shirt or shoes. She wore a faded dress that reached to her ankles. He arose from his seat, but by the time he got to the back porch, they were gone. After that, he saw them all the time. He never saw them arrive, and he never saw them leave. He would just look up, and they would be standing there, watching him. No one else saw them until his sister arrived for Thanksgiving. The moment Laura got out of her car, she sensed something out of the ordinary about the old farm. She spent the first hour walking around with the family, exploring the new place. When they sat down in the living room to rest before dinner, she asked them if the farm was haunted. Mr. Owen said yes, but did not tell Laura his experiences. He wanted to hear her impressions before he told her what had happened to him. Those impressions were very similar to his own. "I think they are brother and sister," she said of the woman and the boy that he kept seeing. "As for the others," Mr. Owens excitedly asked. "The older boy," Laura said. "He was around the shed, the smokehouse. He smells the smoke. And there's the old woman in the kitchen. She doesn't like the changes you've made. She likes to hide things. She thinks people are going to rob her. I don't think she's quite right in the head." "Is there anyone else?" her brother asked. "I saw a marmalade cat," Laura replied. "Where?" "It was sitting among the roots of the old oak tree in the backyard." "We don't have a cat," Mr. Owens replied. "I didn't think so. Real cats don't usually vanish into thin air." After that, the Owens saw the cat quite often, just fleeting glimpses from the corners of their eyes. There were even a few more small fires. If anything went missing, they looked for it in the roots of the old oak tree or in the barn loft. With winter, the woman and the boy stopped appearing. Perhaps it was too cold for them. In the spring, Mr. Owens saw them again, and a neighbor, helping him build a fence, saw them as well. Moreover, the neighbor recognized them. "That's Emmy and Joshua," he explained. "They died of the influenza. I was just a boy then, but I remember them." Mr. Owens informed him about what his sister had told him about the other ghost, and the man knew at least the human ones. The older boy was Mark. He had died, suffocated in the smokehouse after he was locked in there by some other boys. The old woman was Nancy. She died at the age of 98, telling everyone who would listen that people were trying to rob her. Today, the farm is still haunted by the people and the events of the past, but the Owens family has learned to live with them. Emmy and Joshua still come by to watch Mr. Owens work, but now that the house is fully renovated, Nancy bothers him only occasionally. The cat is seen every now and then, but it could be a real cat that strayed onto the property. The only one that is gone is Mark. He left after the family tore down the old smokehouse and planted a flower garden where he passed away.
Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Or Daddy has to fight off a zombie herd. And once that zombie herd is dead, Daddy has to hack off the devil's head. And if that devil's head gets hacked, Daddy has to hunt down a werewolf pack. And when that werewolf pack goes down, Daddy has to slaughter an evil clown. And after the evil clown is killed, Daddy has to take on a vampire guild. So hush, little baby, don't you cry, or Daddy and the whole family will die.
afraid, lock the doors, turn out the lights, and climb into bed. It's time for Hillbilly Deadtime Stories.
Poltergeist cases have been cited almost since the beginning of recorded history. The word poltergeist is German and it loosely translates to a noisy ghost. A poltergeist refers to phenomena usually credited to mischievous spirits or ghosts that are characterized by psychokinesis or even other physical manifestations. Although ghosts may be sometimes involved, most poltergeist incidents are kind of a psychic phenomena, usually centered around a living agent. In most cases, this living agent is actually a young girl going through puberty. This is usually combined with going through a turbulent time in her life, such as possibly a divorce. And that may be the case with today's subject, Juanette McNeil. In 1948, a disturbed teenager named Juanette McNeil moved in with her father. This was shortly after her parents divorced. They moved to a farm west of Macomb, Illinois, and Juanette was very unhappy living there. Her emotions were all over the place because of the bitter divorce, and she began to manifest strange poltergeist activity in the form of small fires that she set with her mind all over the farm. The first fire happened on August 7th on the farm of a man named Charles Willie. At the time, the residents of the farm included Willie, his wife, his brother-in-law, and Juanette's brother, Arthur McNeil, and McNeil's two children, Arthur Jr., who was 8, and Juanette, who had just recently turned 13. The very first fire began not as a blaze, but as a small brown spot that appeared on the wallpaper in the living room of the Willie's farmhouse. That first spot was followed by another, and then another brown spot. The spots would appear, spread out several inches as they smoldered, and then, when they became hot enough, the spots burst into flames. Neighbors had to be called upon to come by the house and put out daily fires. Many of the neighbors stayed on the property, crowding into the house and even sleeping on the floor in an attempt to help keep watch over the situation. And soon, the fire chief was called in to launch an investigation. He had the Willies strip the wallpaper from their house, and the same brown spots then appeared on the bare plaster beneath, erupting into flames before dozens of witnesses. The front porch began to ignite along with the curtains in each room and one bed. Not even the National Fire Underwriters Laboratory, who were called in to investigate, knew why or how the fires were starting. It got to the point in which over 200 fires broke out, averaging 29 per day, and eventually an entire house was destroyed. Willie created a tarp home for his family, but the next day their barn burned down. Days later, the second barn burned down, along with other structures, and the family eventually fled. The U.S. Air Force even got involved as more fires broke out. Soon the farm was filled with over 1,000 people. They were made up of reporters and paranormal researchers and innocent onlookers. Eventually, Juanette was accused of starting the fires with simple kitchen matches. She confessed to the deputy fire marshal and said it was because she was unhappy and didn't like living on the farm. She missed her mother and had caused the fires to rebel. But that never explained the strange brown spots and how they turned into fires, or the fires that happened on the ceilings of buildings, even when Juanette was nowhere around. But the confession made everyone happy, and they closed the case, except for the hundreds of reporters and paranormal researchers who believed that Juanette was the human agent for the poltergeist phenomena. The fires eventually stopped. Juanette was taken to Chicago for examination at the Illinois Juvenile Hospital, but was found to be mentally normal by Dr. Sophie Schrader, a psychiatrist. "She's a nice little kid caught up in the middle of a broken home," she reported. She was later turned over to her grandmother, and she spent the rest of her teenage years with no further incidents. Everyone accepted that she was guilty of arson. Well, not quite everyone. One columnist from the Peoria newspaper, who had covered the case from the beginning, stated quite frankly that he did not believe the so-called confession. Neither did noted researcher The Unexplained Vincent Gaddis, who wrote about the case. He was convinced that the case was a perfect example of poltergeist phenomena. The insurance company eventually paid Mr. Willie for the damage done to his home, and the farm and farmhouse was later rebuilt. Not surprisingly, the case is still listed as unexplained.
Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Or Daddy has to fight off a zombie herd. And once that zombie herd is dead, Daddy has to hack off the devil's head. And if that devil's head gets hacked, Daddy has to hunt down a werewolf pack. And when that werewolf pack goes down, Daddy has to slaughter an evil clown. And after the evil clown is killed, Daddy has to take on a vampire guild. So hush, little baby, don't you cry, or Daddy and the whole family will die.
Don't be afraid. Lock the doors. Turn out the lights and climb into bed. It's time for Hillbilly Deadtime Stories.
It's not unusual to hear of a haunted plantation in the southern part of the United States. After all, most of these plantations ran off of slave labor, and it's no secret that most of these slaves were treated cruelly and in many cases ripped away from their families. This led to overall miserable lives. You add in the tragedies of the Civil War, not to mention the many deaths due to illness such as yellow fever, and you have the perfect breeding ground for hauntings. When you hear the term haunted plantation, the Myrtles plantation is probably the first to come to mind. And for good reason. It is the most well-known haunted plantation. You have probably never heard of the Rotherwood plantation in Tennessee. Until today. Her name was Rowena, and it is said that in her day she was the fairest maiden in all of Holston Valley. There's little doubt that she was her father's greatest joy and his ultimate sorrow. Rowena's father, the Reverend Frederick A. Ross, was a man who always liked to think of himself as a Virginia gentleman. Reverend Ross was quite an enterprising young man. As a matter of fact, it was he who laid out the Tennessee town of Rossville, later called Kingsport, and he founded another community named Christianville. In addition to founding towns, buildings, bridges, and ministering to his flock, the Reverend also ran Rotherwood Plantation. While his duties often kept him quite busy, the Reverend still found time to read. Frederick Ross was particularly fond of the writings of Sir Walter Scott, so much so, in fact, that he named Rotherwood after a locale in Scott's epic romance Ivanhoe. He even named his daughter after the heroine of the same novel. Reverend Ross showered his daughter Rowena with everything a father's money could buy, for he could deny her nothing. In a short span of years, the flaxen-haired Rowena grew from a child to a young woman. As talented as she was beautiful, Rowena was educated in the finest northern schools and was a skilled musician and charming hostess who was much sought after by all the young gentlemen of Kingsport. She had been out of school for just a few years when a young man won her heart and persuaded her to marry him. It so happened that on the day before their wedding, the groom went on a fishing trip on the Holston River with some friends, promising to be back in time for the nuptials. As their small boat drifted down the North Fork of the Holston River toward Rotherwood, some say that the craft had just come within sight of Rowena when it capsized in the river's unpredictable currents. Soon the desperate cries of the drowning men echoed off the surrounding hills. Reverend Ross's servants rushed to the men's assistance, as did everyone else within earshot. All of the men were rescued except for one, Rowena's beloved. Rescue parties searched all day and into the night, and when dawn came, they dragged the river once more. Finally, at the very hour the young couple were to have been wed, searchers recovered the groom's body. His bloated and discolored corpse was brought ashore near Rotherwood as beautiful Rowena looked on in horror. Words cannot express the agony the young girl suffered in the weeks and the months that followed. The outgoing, fun-loving Rowena became a semi-recluse, rarely venturing forth from the confines of Rotherwood. After 2 years, she finally emerged from her mourning and gradually began to socialize again. She met new people and seemed to have regained at least part of her former joyous spirit. In time, Rowena married one of the many suitors eager for her hand, a rich man with a good reputation from the Knoxville area. For a while, it seemed that Rowena had regained her happiness, but before long, her new husband contracted yellow fever and died. And then the beautiful young woman, again, entered a period of mourning. Rowena eventually emerged from her grief, but it would be 10 years before she could bring herself to accept the hand of another suitor. Her second marriage, to Edward Temple of Alabama, produced a daughter also named Rowena. But happiness, once more, proved elusive for the sad-eyed lady of the Highlands. Haunted by the spirit of her dead lover who called nightly. Haunted by the spirit of her drowned lover who called for her nightly. Or perhaps it was simply the sight of the mansion and its grounds brought back all the painful memories to a woman already weary of this world. Either way, one moonlit night, Rowena heard the call of the river. No one else heard it, but to Rowena, it was as clear as a siren's song. She climbed the wooden staircase to the upper floor and, opening a large leather and wood chest, drew out an old wedding dress, the gown in which she had planned to marry her first love. Donning the white dress, Rowena descended the stairs once more, moving swiftly and silently so as not to wake anyone. Forsaking her 6-year-old daughter and all others who still loved her, Rowena strolled quickly through the moonlit trees, making her way down to the slope of the river. Some say that from the banks of the Holston's North Fork, Rowena could see in the moonlight a pale gray hand beckoning her from the middle of the river. Was it the wind rustling through the trees? Or could she really hear a voice gently whispering, "Come to me and be my love"? Rowena, as if in a trance, calmly walked into the water. Mountain streams in this area run clear and very cold, but that night the Holston River felt warm and welcoming to the pale lady. The water slowly enveloped and devoured the flaxen-haired beauty, and that was the last of Rowena Ross Temple and the beginning of the legend of Rotherwood. Not long after Rowena's death, neighbors and passerbys began to see a young woman dressed all in white wandering the banks of the Holston River near the Rotherwood mansion. Many believe it is the spirit of Rowena searching the riverbank for her lost love. Joe Ellis, whose parents were caretakers at Rotherwood in the 1920s, remembers vividly the lady in white. She recalls seeing the shade of Rowena sitting upstairs in a rocking chair, waiting for her lost love to arrive. A doctor in Kingsport recalls a boyhood encounter with the specter while picking strawberries at Rotherwood. One day, as he knelt by a patch of strawberries, the lady in white walked up and stood next to him. That was the last time he ventured into the plantation grounds. The lady in white is not the only restless spirit wandering about Rotherwood. Frederick Ross, distraught over the loss of his only child, lost interest in worldly affairs. His numerous business interests began to falter and he fell into debt. In 1847, to pay Ross's debts, Rotherwood and over 1,000 acres of land were sold to Joshua Phipps. The Reverend Ross was a very good, godly man. He was concerned with the matters of the spirit and of the mind. Joshua Phipps, on the other hand, was a man wholly inclined to be the opposite. East Tennessee in the mid-19th century generally was not a slave-holding region, and plantations such as Rotherwood were rare. Rotherwood had upwards of 40 slaves in its heyday, a large number by East Tennessee standards, but small by comparison to the great plantations of West Tennessee and Mississippi. Though slavery and being a slave owner was despicable in its own right, the stereotype of the plantation owner as a sadistic monster was more the exception and not the rule. Unfortunately, Joshua Phipps was one of the exceptions. It's said that Phipps had a mean streak as wide as the Tennessee River. People in Kingsport don't like to talk much about Phipps even today, and if they do, it's usually under their breath as if they're afraid that he might hear what they are actually saying. What horrors transpired at Rotherwood under Phipps's rule remains a matter of morbid speculation, but they were real enough. The owner kept a whipping post in his room on the mansion's 3rd floor, and there he would brutalize his slaves whenever he pleased. Their blood still stains the room's floorboards. To this day, it's said that when it rains, the stains return, as if the house cannot forget the cruelty it has witnessed. People began to shun Rotherwood. It's no wonder, since agonizing screams emanating from the upstairs whipping room occasionally could be heard echoing through the surrounding hills. The cruelty of Joshua Phipps was proverbial, and his reputation for cruelty became part of the mansion's legend. Generations later, parents in the area still used his name as kind of a byword for the boogeyman. "Don't go out after dark or Joshua Phipps will get you," they would warn. There seemed to be something unnatural about Phipps's cruelty, and the manner of his death and his subsequent burial only served to confirm area residents' beliefs that the house was infested by a wickedness of supernatural proportions. From the fall of 1847 to the summer of 1861, Phipps continued to prosper, while his slaves endured his evil reign as best that they could. But just before Tennessee and the rest of the nation plunged into the massive bloodletting that was the American Civil War, Phipps fell deathly ill. A black youth stood nearby, gently fanning him, and was witness to the man's last moments. As Phipps laid on his deathbed, gasping for breath, swarms of flies materialized, seemingly out of nowhere, and made straight for the stricken man. More and more flies came into the room, landing on Phipps' face and crawling into his mouth and nostrils, until every orifice on his face was filled with the crawling, buzzing insects. The black youth stood there paralyzed with horror as the man choked and gasped for air through the obscene mass. Within minutes, Phipps was dead. The Lord of the Flies had come to collect his own. On July 10, 1861, hundreds gathered at Rotherwood Mansion to attend Phipps' funeral, more out of curiosity than sympathy, one suspects. Once the service was completed, the coffin was carried outside and placed in the horse-drawn wagon for the trip to the graveyard. Strangely, however, when the driver snapped the reins, the horses strained in their harnesses but could not budge the wagon. The sky began to darken, taking on a leaden and gloomy effect. After much effort, a stronger team of horses was brought out and hitched to the hearse. Again, the driver snapped his reins and cracked his whip, but the wagon moved only a few feet. A third team, consisting of large dray horses, was brought up and harnessed to the wagon, and with considerable difficulty managed to pull the hearse carrying Phipps up the hill toward the cemetery. All the while, the sky became darker and darker, and it appeared that a terrible storm was brewing. As the black draped casket approached the final destination, a flash of lightning split the heavens. An ominous rumble echoed across the valley, and a rush of bone-chilling, unnaturally cold air swept over the crowd. At that exact moment, the black crepe draped over the coffin began to rustle. The crowd turned to watch in horror as the large black dog emerged from under the cloth and, once free of the hearse, raced up and over the hill. Everyone stood still, stunned in silent horror at the spectacle. As the rain beat down on the mourners and the onlookers alike, Phipps's remains were quickly interred, and those in attendance made their way home as quickly as they could. That night, everyone made sure that they locked their windows and bolted their doors. Since then, many in Kingsport have said that the very same hound of hell can be heard at night, especially on the dark and stormy nights, as it wanders the grounds of Rotherwood and the nearby woods, baying eerily in the gloom. A third ghost also haunts Rotherwood, and is perhaps related to Phipps's malevolent spirit. Known as the Lady in Black, this apparition, like the Lady in White, has been seen at various times wandering the plantation grounds. The Lady in Black is believed to be the ghost of a mulatto woman who was Phipps's mistress. It is said that the woman was even more malicious and evil than her lover, and that she grievously mistreated the estate's slaves. The Lady in Black was done in by a mob of vengeful slaves who had had enough of her cruelty. Her screams, like those of her victims, resounded through the mansion as the mob savagely beat her to death. The slaves secretly buried her on the grounds of Rotherwood to escape punishment by civil authorities, and to this day, her gravesite remains unknown. The Rotherwood plantation has had many owners over the years. Even though several of these owners have came and went, the spirits, it seems, have chosen to stay.